In the 1960s, Ian Chalmers noted in his medical training that different physicians who he was being taught by would often have drastically different management plans for the same conditions. Despite having differing outcomes for the patients, neither physician would yield to the other's methodology. Chalmers believed this was generally due to the lineage of their knowledge. Prior to the rise in popularity of evidence-based medicine, students and clinicians relied upon evidence-based medicine. Vinay Prasad, a professor of medicine at Oregon Health and Science, described this practice as, "For thousands of years, what was medicine but something that somebody of esteemed authority had done for many years and told others that, it worked for me, so you better do it." Best practice was most determined by who was the most charismatic and successful in the field, combined with the use of often scarcely available and outdated research. While this is Dr. Prasad's assessment, perhaps it is more generously framed as subjectivity-based medicine predicated upon intuition, clinical experience, and pathophysiological rationale, with an approach based upon scientific evidence. This evidence, however, was often poorly spread. Ian Chalmers experienced firsthand the poor dissemination of knowledge in the field when he was working in a refugee camp in Gaza. At medical school, he had been taught never to prescribe antibiotics to a manifestation of the measles virus. Much to Dr. Chalmers' horror, he later found out that at the time of his placement, there had been 6 studies that had shown the efficacy of antibiotic use in patients with this condition. Many of those children who died subsequent to bacterial infection or pneumonia, in Dr. Chalmers' opinion, they could have been saved. This led Chalmers on a career that led him to being one of the founding members of the Cochrane Collaboration and being a lifelong advocate for evidence-based medicine. The Cochrane Collaboration was dedicated to the accumulation of systematic reviews and high-standard information, along with making it easily accessible to clinicians all over the world. Muir Gray would define evidence-based practice thusly: evidence-based clinical practice is an approach to decision-making in which the clinician uses the best scientific evidence available, in consultation with the patient, to decide upon the option which suits the patient best. Ultimately, it is this field's best attempt to apply the scientific method to treatment strategies and then implement them. There are 3 core components outlined in Archie Cochrane's, for whom the Cochrane Collaboration is named, in his original vision for evidence-based practice: evidence, expert knowledge, and patient preference. As a student at QUT and with the QAS, there is an incredibly high value placed upon evidence-based medicine. There are very few interventions that we are taught to engage in as pre-hospital clinicians that don't have a solid body of evidence behind them. A perhaps notable exception could be the efficacy of the use of adrenaline in cardiac arrest when it comes to outcomes such as survival to discharge. But to the end of promoting us as evidence-based practitioners, we've been taught statistical analysis, how to appraise and evaluate articles, and we are being constantly encouraged by both lecturers and mentors to engage in critical reflection and inquiry into why we do what we do. The evidence-based practice movement is not without its critics, and those critics have some legitimate concerns. A 2015 article published in the Health Research and Policies Journal made the contention that evidence-based practice had risen up in an age that desired standardization, concerned about financial stability of clinical health systems, and was filled with a glut of data, and finally had the communities that could deal with huge amounts of it. These authors contended that evidence-based practice had, in response to this need for medicine to justify itself, evidence-based practice had set itself up as an authority with only its word that it was the most effective manner by which to assess best practice. Their conclusion was that evidence-based practice was best utilized in discovery rather than implementation, where clinical complexity can overcome that raw data. The Lancet Journal has had a historically critical view of evidence-based practice as a discipline. For them, it was excellent that evidence-based practice had brought to the fore the need to gather and then disseminate the highest quality of evidence and then spread it to clinicians. However, they firmly disagreed with evidence-based practice that value of placing internal validity as the highest ideal, generally and often to the expense of external validity and the generalizability of findings to the population. In summary, these critics would say that there is an unhealthy bias towards evidence and away from patient preference and clinical judgment. It has also been criticised for the manner by which it came about. Namely, that evidence-based practice came to prominence not by evidence, but by the same authoritative knowledge that the movement railed against, and often the use of the Matthew effect by its proponents, which is the consistent cross-citation of one another's work in order to raise its validity. With this wielding of authority, some have accused evidence-based practice proponents of a cookie-cutter approach to practice through the use of enforceable clinical guidelines. There appears to be a moment which calls for evidence-based practice to return to its original calling of using not only evidence, but expert experience and patient preference. It is a call for a different epistemology than merely the use of randomized controlled trials. There is a philosophical tension that philosophers like Carl Jung and Friedrich Nietzsche have noted between factual knowledge and implementable wisdom. Many of the objectors to evidence-based practice would say that it so often reduces a problem down to a point where it becomes unusable. But there are also more personal reasons that medical practitioners were complaining. One physician at a meeting of the British Medical Association remarked to Ian Chalmers, "What the hell did people who were statisticians and other non-doctors think they were doing messing around in territory which they shouldn't be messing around in?" Chalmers responded, "When patients start complaining about the objectives of evidence-based medicine, then one should take the criticism seriously. Up until then, assume it's basically vested interests playing their way out." Chalmers would believe that so often doctors are wanting to protect their understanding and their clinical judgment, and so they don't want to be told what to do. So, what is the crux of this issue? Where does evidence-based practice have the greatest utility? And how can this resource be applied to the pre-hospital arena as well as medicine broadly? It appears that the best use of evidence-based practice is where it can be used to produce unintuitive results. An example of this was the Cardiac Arrhythmia Suppression Trial, or CAST. This study, published in 1991, contradicted the best practice of the day, which was based upon logic along with solid, understandable pathophysiology. At the time, Class 1 antiarrhythmics were administered to suppress aberrant arrhythmias such as PVCs after a myocardial infarction to hopefully improve mortality. The CAST study found that in a double-blind randomized control trial, that these drugs did not improve survival outcomes and often led to increased mortality. These sodium channel blockers would counterintuitively be pro-arrhythmic in the animal trials that were subsequently undertaken. Results such as these are invaluable, and due to the rigorous scientific methodology that is prized by evidence-based practitioners, there have been many similar breakthroughs. Vinay Prasad puts it this way: "It doesn't really matter in medicine that the smartest people believe something works. The only thing that really counts at the end of the day is what is the evidence you have that it works." So, how does this interact with pre-hospital practice specifically? It is my contention that while pre-hospital medicine is hoping to become a fully fledged academic field on its own, it's not there yet, and all boats rise with the tide. The work that evidence-based practice have done in the fields of nursing and medicine have resulted in evidence-based protocols for early intervention in all sorts of patients that we see now in the QAS. Hydrocortisone for respiratory impairment, ceftriaxone for meningococcal being two good examples, where we don't see the benefits in the pre-hospital arena, but it pays dividends down the line. Being a young field of inquiry, it is my hope that our research can learn from the many methodological and epistemological mistakes of nursing and medicine, and set out with the intent of producing high-quality evidence and developing clinically intelligent paramedics who can take that raw data with a grain of salt and then apply it to clinically complex situations. To conclude, for myself, I have been taught the immense value of both evidence and clinical reasoning when it comes to implementing life-altering interventions to patients. I hope to see this trend continue into the future, where evidence-based practice can provide safe frameworks for difficult decisions. It can provide financially sustainable healthcare by analysing effective treatments with dubious results and filling the gap that clinical knowledge, pathophysiology, and intuition are unable to.